Welcome to our Perspectives in Sacred Space series. This has been a dream series of mine for a few years now. And as I read and reflected more and more on how architecture and space can be vehicles for diving into questions about relationships between architecture and gender, architecture and race, architecture and religion, of course, Mike and I, Dr. Crosby and I worked on making this series a reality. So thank you. Thank you, Dr. Crosby, for your help on this. For those of you who are new to our space here, I'm Vanessa Avery, Executive Director of Sharing Sacred Spaces, where we bring people together across difference through dialogue, education, and hospitality, and most uniquely through the medium of architecture and space. For this series, we asked the guiding question, how do space and culture interact? So this series in 4 parts will bring in experts from the fields of architecture and religion to reflect on the intersections of form, culture, and belief. In this first session, Dr. Tammy Gaber will present a compelling talk on gendered space and community experience in Canadian mosque design. The talk is based on her new and groundbreaking book, Beyond the Divide. And this is the first, and I can show you my proud copy, the first comprehensive study of mosques across Canada. You can get it on Amazon, although last I checked, they had just gone out of stock. I got the last copy, but I hope they have more now. Dr. Tammy Gaber is director and associate professor at the MacEwan School of Architecture, where she teaches architecture design and theory courses. She was one of the MacEwan School of Architecture's founding faculty in 2013 and previously taught at the University of Waterloo, American University in Cairo, and the British University in Egypt. Dr. Gaber completed an SSHRC-funded research project which led to her book with McGill Queen's Press. And she's published on gender and architecture with a chapter in the forthcoming Global Encyclopedia of Women in Architecture from Bloomsbury Press. In 2019, she won the Women Who Inspire Award from the Canadian Council of Muslim Women. And in 2020, she was awarded Laurentian University's Teaching Excellence Award for a full-time professor. Tonight, we'll hear a presentation from Dr. Gaber and then a dialogue between Dr. Michael Crosby and Dr. Gaber. And Dr. Michael Crosby is professor of architecture at the University of Hartford in Connecticut. I'll give a fuller bio of him as we move forward in the presentation. Dr. Gaber, without further ado, the floor is yours.
Okay, great. So let's share screen. Oh, okay, it's shared perfectly. Does it fill the whole screen for everyone? Is that good? Okay, fantastic. Thank you everyone for coming out today. I'll be talking about my research project. It's called Beyond the Divide, A Century of Canadian Mosque Design. It has roots for me in my examination, my personal journey through architecture and as a Muslim. So growing up as a Muslim in Canada, I visited a lot of mosques and found all of them had different kinds of spaces, whether it was for activities, but mostly the different kinds of spaces were about gender, right? So I encountered separate spaces for women, space separated by a wall, and I'll talk about that with my project. But as I went through architecture school, I wasn't really taught anything outside the Western canon, and it was only with my research, with my graduating project and my master's and PhD studies that I started to really learn about what mosque architecture was. Now, this image that I'm showing you, this is the Kaaba in Mecca. And this is a very important space for the Abrahamic faiths. And for Muslims, they believe that there is a connection here to Abraham, to Ishmael, and to Hagar. And she's actually buried right here. And I find this to be very moving. Now, this is the center of the Islamic world. All mosques are oriented towards Kaaba. But when you pray at Kaaba, instead of standing in lines to orient, what you do is you circumambulate. You walk around in circles. And when the call to prayer happens, and there are 5 prayers a day, everyone stops what they're doing and they pray. Okay, so take a look at this image. And what we see here are men and women praying together in a non-gendered space. And that's how it's been for 1400 years. So this was a photograph I took when I did the Hajj a few years ago. And it was really impactful for me to see this prototypical moment, right? And it inspired a lot of the research that I did. Just as a kind of quick note to orient those who maybe aren't so familiar with the faith, is that there's 5 pillars to the Islamic faith: proclamation in the faith, the prayers, and this is a drawing study I did of the positions of prayer and how the body's inscribed in the proportions of the carpet, because very little furniture is actually needed for mosques other than orientation, a clean space, and the rugs. The 3rd pillar is charity, like annual charitable donations, fasting from sunrise to sunset during the month of Ramadan, and pilgrimage to Kaaba, what I just showed you here. So what inspired this project was, as I said, I did my PhD dissertation on the subject, but my subject was on the history of women's spaces in mosques. And I looked at primary sources like the Quran and the Ahadith, and I studied historical mosques and tried to unearth exactly what moment and when did mosque architecture decide that women should be separated. And the answer was very nuanced. And it came, hundreds of years after the creation of the faith. Was there ever a separation designed? And the design of the separation of men and women really ranged depending on location and culture and inheritance in different regions. And so in my recent study, so in about 2014, 2015, I thought, okay, I want to learn about mosques in Canada. I started researching. I couldn't find anything. I found very little, and it was anecdotal. And I thought, okay, well, this material needs to be documented. I know it exists. I put in a request and won a federal grant. And the grant allowed me to travel to 53 different cities across the country to document 90 mosques. Now, there's about 160 to 180 mosques in Canada, so the sample is actually quite large. Full disclosure, my grant proposal said I'd visit 40 mosques, but like everything I do, it just kind of snowballed, literally. I went as far north as Inuvik and Iqaluit, which would be the 2 most northern mosques on the continent, or in the hemisphere, actually. And those presented some really interesting questions of translation of faith that far up north. I went as far west as Victoria and Vancouver, and as far east as St. John's in Newfoundland. I'm just going to minimize, I don't know how much I'm blocking, but I'll just minimize that. And I traveled through the entire country, as you can see, and every province I went to, I made a point of visiting the first mosque that was built. I made a point of visiting mosques for different sects. And I made a point of visiting mosques that were purpose-built or in converted spaces. On every visit, for a mosque visit, I prepared ahead of time. I contacted community members and governance ahead of time in order to arrange my visit. And sometimes community members helped me arrange visits for other mosques. I would go and photograph the exterior and the interior, and I would document enough of the interior so that architectural drawings could be made accurately for each space that I visited, documenting in color code the space for women and the space for men, and orientation. I also interviewed members of the mosque governance, of users and architects, so I can get a more fulsome picture. My intention with the study was not to create a coffee book of pretty buildings. My intention was to document a history of communities and how this community has created space and made place for activities to happen and contributed to the built environment and beyond the bricks and mortar of the buildings. So it was really important for me to include all of the spaces I visited, to include the stories and the impact that these places had. So the first mosque I visited was the first mosque constructed in Canada. So there have been Muslims in Canada since the 1800s, and I relied on a number of primary resources such as the census and documentation about Muslims in Canada. But the first purpose-built mosque was this one right here. It was called Al Rashid, and it was constructed in 1938. Prior to the construction of this mosque, Muslim communities did what they always do in the diaspora. They met in each other's homes, they borrowed churches, they borrowed community centers, they rented spaces until they could put together enough money to either convert a space, or in this case, have one purpose built. Now it's interesting, this one was purpose built during the Depression. And it was made possible by contributions not only of Muslims in Edmonton, but throughout the prairie provinces, and contributions from non-Muslims, from people of the Christian and Jewish faith that lived in the prairies, contributed to the construction, to the cost for the construction of this mosque. Mike Dreworth is the builder on record for this building, and you can see a little bit of his Ukrainian heritage coming through in those domes at the top of the minaret. Otherwise, the building is constructed using a typical prairie architecture of Canada, the gabled roof, the red brick, and this is speaking to what I see here is a translation of ideas and community into the local built fabric. Now, the design of the mosque, by default, it's an open space that doesn't have a lot of furniture, so it does allow for multi-purpose activities. And in fact, as I spoke to people who use the mosque and read about it, I did learn that the mosque was loaned out to many non-Muslim communities, the larger community, for a range of activities, and it was used for celebration, for mourning, for gathering, and so forth. I've shown here the architectural plans for this building. In red, I always show the space for women, and in gray is there's space for men. Now, if there's an architectural demarcation between them, like a wall, that tells you there's a separation. In this case, when this mosque was built, there was no separation between men and women. They arranged themselves in a kind of a social fashion in this way. Sorry, let me just go to the next slide. So there's the interior. And again, to emphasize the point that not much furniture is needed. It needs to be a clean space. The rugs can be smaller individual scaled rugs or large rugs that can be rolled up. People generally, when they enter a mosque, remove their shoes and do ritual washing called wudu. And that is to, get the mind ready and the body ready for this spiritual experience that is to happen during prayer. The actions of prayer, like that drawing that I showed, they're different from standing to bending over position to ultimately putting your head down on the ground. The other elements of a mosque interior that are needed would be a clear orientation to Mecca. Now, this happens in traditional mosques with a niche that's decorated. And here we have just some wall hangings that tell us that this is the direction. There is something like a pulpit. It's called a minbar, and that's where the lecture can be given to the community. And when we come to Canadian communities, especially ones in pioneering communities like this one, everyone is of a different cultural heritage, and the common language is English. So what's spoken in the mosque is English, and that's what would be here at the pulpit. Let's move on. I did go as far north as Inuvik, the Midnight Sun Mosque. And it, like I said before, it is the most northern mosque in this hemisphere. And this is such an interesting mosque. I was so curious to learn about this community and this building. And like I said, what meant a lot to me for this study was to talk about the stories of why and how these places were made and what they meant. So in this far up north, it took 6 flights to get here, by the way, like a full day. This far up north, it's actually, the ground is permanently frozen. It's called permafrost, and everything, all the utilities run above the door. So all the buildings have to be elevated because, the heating and the water, nothing can run underground. Also, it's really cold and really expensive to build there. So in fact, this mosque was constructed in Winnipeg and put on the back of a truck and then a barge for 4,500 kilometers, right? Transported to Inuvik and then propped up. So all the utilidor surfaces are beneath it. So the dimensions of the mosque were governed by the maximum dimensions of the transportation of the highway, of the truck bed, right? Interestingly, at this mosque as well, if you take a look at the floor plan, what you can see here is there's a predominant dedication of space to men and a much smaller dedication of space to women. Now you'll say, why did this happen? And this is a result of the conversation between the community and the architect. So the community says this is what they want. And if the architect doesn't push back or question or discuss, right, this is what's designed, right? And so a smaller space was designed. It's actually separated by a wall with a small window in it. And so there's a very minimal view into the main space. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a bit. The other thing you'll notice in the plan is that there's a kind of a small rectangle. That is a container that's been converted into a food bank. So as one of the kind of 5 pillars of Islam, it's charity and donation. And so charitable donations from Canadians all over Canada come to this mosque and are given out to people in the form of food. And it's not just for Muslims, but for the larger community. So it functions on that level. I'll just move along. And here's the interior. And the interior, again, is furnished by donations from the community and beyond to embellish it, make it feel special, or have materials, reading materials, and so forth. Sorry, I'm trying to, not sure why it's not shifting with me here. Oh, there we go. Okay. Sorry, I don't know why it skipped like 5 slides. All right. Another example of a northern mosque, maybe not as northern as Inuvik, would be in Prince George, and that's in northern British Columbia. Now, this is an example of a purpose-built mosque with a community that had a little bit more funds. And there was a huge debate in the community. Do they use the funds to build the biggest box ever to, enclose safely and warmly maximum number of people? Or do they invest in design, right? So the president of the mosque is so proud. When he gave me a tour, he was speaking to me basically as if he was the architect, how proud he was of this space. He really fought for a well-designed space. Now, what does a well-designed space mean for him? It meant something that connected to the location. There's a huge timber industry in this part of British Columbia. A lot of timber products are used in the construction of this mosque. He wanted a beautiful space that spoke to its location. So let me show you another image. So right away, so Sharif Sembo, who's the architect of Sembo Studio, and he's designed a number of mosques in British Columbia, and he is always cognizant and and proactive in collaborating with local craftspeople, right, at every scale of the building. So from designing literally the rugs to the structure. In this case, there is a strong collaboration with craftspeople for the use of timber materials. Glulam or glue laminated wood is used throughout, and collaboration with the glass artist etching traditional designs on the glass. And this moment, this is a very moving moment. So as I said, mosques all over the world orient themselves to Mecca. Now, often that orientation is a blank wall with a niche in it, and the niche might have some writing or some decoration that talks about paradise, right? Or the promise of paradise. And paradise in Islam is often described as with vegetal forms or decoration. And this is meaningful for me because what I see here is an interpretation of the mihrab, where there isn't decoration, but instead of decoration, it's transparent glass showing the landscape of northern Canada, showing a northern paradise, right? So if you study the history of mosques, as I have, you'll know that the vegetal forms used in India are specific to India, right, in the mosques. And the vegetal forms used in mosques in Egypt are specific to Egypt. And I can even name you the species, right? And so there's always been a history of interpreting the specificity of the vegetation of paradise in the mihrab or in the surface elaboration of a mosque. And we see it here, not interpreted, but represented, right? And I find that to be quite a moving moment at this particular mosque here. And here you can see the glulam or the glue laminated, the timber products used for the structure of the building. Also, what you see here is a different approach or quote unquote solution to separating men from women. And in this case, it's in a balcony. So throughout my study, I documented the different ways women were included or separated in the mosque space. So sometimes it was a room. Sometimes it was a balcony. Sometimes there was no separation, right? And so I documented this, and I was very careful to document what I saw. And I was able to experience a range of spaces because I have agency in a number of different ways. And it's always with full disclosure that I would share this. I have agency as an academic and a scholar that I could enter the men's spaces and photograph them, and I normally wouldn't have that kind of access, right? But I have agency as a woman and as a Muslim to be able to enter the women's spaces that normally are very rarely documented and entered. And so I was able to kind of look at the big picture and document all of this. Now, by including everything, sorry, I just went back a couple of slides, in architectural form, I can show in plan, in color, the proportion of men to women, right? And it was only after I studied a large number of mosques that I could start to see patterns that I could identify. Now, those patterns aren't based on materials or even architectural demarcations. For me, those patterns I classified in 3 different ways: rooms with a view, rooms without a view, rooms with some view. And what that started to describe is the visual and sound and physical accessibility of these spaces. Okay. I made a point, and it was really important for me to visit Muslim spaces. Not all Muslim spaces are mosques. There's a number of different types of names, but for the purpose of the book, I called it mosques. There are different Muslim spaces like prayer halls, or in this case, Jamaat Khanas or Ismaili centers for the Ismaili sect of Islam. And the Jamaat Khana literally means a place of gathering. It is a Muslim space of gathering. And in this one that I went to in Burnaby, it was particularly special because it was one of the few where there was a dedicated effort for the design of landscape. And I've already talked about how important paradise is in the religious concept of Islam. So having a paradise interpreted here with local flora and trees in this landscape is quite powerful. It serves as a powerful preamble to the main space. And in fact, you can probably tell right away from this photograph that the same geometries are used in the landscape and the hardscape as in the architecture. You'll also note from the plan here that men and women occupy the space equally without an architectural division and are divided down the middle perpendicular to the Qibla wall. So this allows for complete and equitable access to the space. Oh, sorry, I went ahead quite quickly. And this is an image of the community space. A pattern I found in a lot of mosques throughout Canada, not a lot, all of them, was the importance and the aspiration for community space. Mosques for the diaspora community function much more and beyond sacred and worship. They function as community spaces for celebration, for mourning, for gathering. A lot of spaces would even be used, and this is very Canadian, for screening hockey games, for voting centers, for swearing in ceremonies, for citizenship ceremonies, and just a range of youth activities and sports. And in fact, the space that every mosque wanted to have was a gymnasium, right? And it spoke to the generations of people using the mosque. A pattern I can identify quite confidently is that when it was designed into the mosque, that there was full accessibility, there was consistent use across generations of the mosque, and a kind of a real sense of inclusion. So I've given you a kind of a brief hint. I don't know what's happening here. There's a bit of a lag. Okay. I've given a brief hint of some of the mosques I studied. I obviously can't talk about all 90 of them, but there's my book. And in my book, I was able to categorize my findings into really regionally dominant patterns, right? And I think maybe I'll be able to talk a bit more about some of these ideas with the questions I'm sure Mike is going to ask me. And that's it. I can stop sharing and we can go back to our lovely gallery view.
That was really, really fantastic. And the views of paradise represented are really especially gorgeous. Dr. Crosby is, as mentioned, a professor of architecture at the University of Hartford in Connecticut. He served as the editor-in-chief of Faith and Form, the interfaith journal on religion, art, and architecture since 2001. He's the author of a plethora of books and articles on architecture, design, and practice. Dr. Crosby is a frequent contributor to international print and online publications and lectures on architecture throughout the US and abroad. A registered architect, Dr. Crosby was the Walton Visiting Critic at the Catholic University of America School of Architecture and Planning in 2015. And to my great delight, he serves on the board of Sharing Sacred Spaces. Dr. Crosby, turning it over to you.
Thank you very, very much. It's really a real pleasure to be with you and with Tammy and our guests tonight. I want to have a little bit of full disclosure here. I know Tammy very well. We have been colleagues and friends for, I don't know, Tammy, what, 10 years or something like that?
Yeah.
Yeah. And I've really had a great respect for her work, for her research, her scholarship, and her insights into sacred space. And I call upon Tammy very frequently to share her research and her perspectives on sacred space with my students at the University of Hartford. One of the staples of my studio I teach a graduate design studio at the University of Hartford. And for those of us here who don't know what a studio is, what the studio setup this is kind of the central this is kind of the central space for architectural education in the United States and other places. It usually occupies a very important part of the curriculum. More time and effort is devoted to the architecture studio than any other class in the curriculum. It usually takes up 6 or 8 hours of contact time a week, which is very a huge amount of curriculum time. And it's in the studio that students design projects that they've been assigned during the course of the semester. So one of the most important assignments I give my students, and I teach primarily graduate students, is to design a sacred space. And the sacred space of my choice has, for the past, since 2006, as a matter of fact, has been to design a mosque. And the reason I've done this is that most of our students do not come from a background where they're familiar with this building type. And one of the challenges for an architecture professor is usually to give students something they've never had to deal with before. You know, everybody's been to a library, everybody lives in a house or an apartment. We've all gone to a museum at some point, but it's a real challenge for many of my students to design a sacred space like a mosque, because they have absolutely zero personal experience with that kind of building, right? So what's wonderful about that, for me, is that this is something that they're completely unprepared for. And part of being a good architect is doing good research before you actually start designing anything. So Tammy has played an incredibly important role in educating our students about mosques and mosque design and mosque decoration. And one of the things that she has been extremely helpful with is this whole notion of gender in sacred space, right? So just last week, Tammy gave a lecture to my students on mosque design and gender. And one of the things that I think was very important for her to point out was the kind of trajectory and history of this gender separation as she's documented in her dissertation and in her research on mosques in Canada. So I'd like to ask Tammy a question, which is, where does this come from?
Okay,
Where
long
did
answer, short answer. So the answer to that was actually like an entire PhD, but I'll give the kind of the short version of it. And it's such a good question because it's the one that actually propelled me to do all of this work.
Yeah.
Right? Like as a young person using spaces, I was so confused why they were so different. And I was so confused why in Canada I could have access to every space equally. And yet I'd go into the one space I should find contemplation and I didn't. So I was like, what's
Right.
going on here? No one had answers for me. And so that's really what propelled me to study. So what I found in my PhD was like that image I showed you at Mecca, at Kaaba, that that prototypical space of prayer is all access. Right? And that the first mosques designed in the history of Islam were all access, and arrangements for who stood where depended on the community negotiating it without architecture. Architectural elements really started to kind of sneak into mosque language only about 700 years into Islam, and it really depended on cultural inheritance. I think the big shift in mosque design happened with the Ottoman Empire, taking over Constantinople, becoming Istanbul. If you know a little bit of history of that, you know that the architecture of the Ottomans was inspired by Hagia Sophia, that magnificent Christian church that stood for 1,000 years before it was converted into a mosque. Now, Byzantine churches, for a period of time, it was common in Byzantine churches to have a gynoeceum, or a space for women in a balcony. Now, these are celebrated large spaces, but they were separated. They became inherited along with that large central dome and subsumed into Ottoman architecture and really spread throughout the Ottoman Empire, normalizing this kind of spatial separation. And from then on, I can't use the word innovation. I would say from then on, everyone just thought that it became a cultural norm to separate men from women, even though, and I always talk to people about this, I'm like, don't you realize there's a disconnect when you go to Mecca and there isn't a separation? Right? And so that's, something I put my finger on, but of course my PhD is far more nuanced than that, pointing at several cultural moments of other types of building influencing the architecture of the mosque.
Now, we know that in a lot of religious architecture, sacred architecture, that things are done for a specific reason, and those reasons are usually textual. It's in the Bible, or it's in the Quran, or it's in the Torah that this has to happen. This in a sacred space, this has to happen. So tell me where in the Quran it says that women and men must be separated.
It doesn't. It doesn't. And that's what my PhD was studying. I read through the Quran. I didn't just read the Quran. I read the ahadith, which are like these sayings or kind of transcriptions of sayings and actions of the Prophet. And even then I couldn't find. What I found were examples, and these are 8th century, 9th century texts, describing anecdotally how the Prophet heard a baby crying. So he knew that the mother didn't want the mother to feel uncomfortable, so made prayer short, right? And there's all these anecdotes describing, okay, there's a small group of people, we're going to arrange ourselves in this way in order to pray. But never was there a description in the hadith or in the Quran of any kind of architectural separation between men and women, right? So this is a very cultural innovation, not a religious one.
Okay. So can you tell us a little bit about the origins of this cultural separation? Like what's the point of doing this?
Like I said, I mean, there's examples of it that I found that were kind of influenced from predominantly patriarchal societies. And in the Middle East prior to Islam and during Islam, a very patriarchal society. And you can see that kind of creeping in architecturally into the language of buildings, right? And becoming more and more normalized. And that's as best as I can put my finger on it, right? But it was so interesting for me to see that for at least the first 700 years, if not a bit more, there were mosques designed without architectural separation. And we know women use the mosques because there's so much history about women teaching and participating in the mosque. So we know we used it without architectural separation. I lived and taught in Cairo for 12 years. And I would do these tours of old Cairo with my students and give live lectures at the historic buildings and the mosques. And it always struck me, I in fact did a whole paper on this. I would go into these mosques that were over 1,000 years old, and there was no historical separation between men and women, but that separation was added later on in such an ad hoc, non-historical way that it would be personally offensive to me to see some of these kind of ad hoc constructions. And I would, being who I am and being the educator that I am, I'd go in and give my lecture, sometimes from the pulpit, to my class and really kind of occupy the space as an academic with my students. But when the call to prayer would happen, sometimes be relegated behind these ad hoc constructions that were really offensive. And even my own students, male and female, would be like, Dr. Gaber, what do you want us to do? Right? Because they knew right away that something wasn't right.
Right. And so what I'm trying to get to here is that if there's this separation, what is the impetus behind the separation? Like what is the problem here that we're trying to solve with the separation?
Yeah, it's hard for me to answer because I think that the perceived issue is a lot of inherited notions that somehow women may be impure during menstrual cycles. And again, that's not written anywhere that, that they make the space impure. There
Okay.
may be a perception that seeing or hearing a woman is somehow a temptation, right?
Okay.
So never was that addressed architecturally in any of the texts that I read, religious or
Okay.
otherwise. So these are like very patriarchal cultural notions that start to literally creep into the architecture of mosques, right? And they
Okay.
can creep in slowly. And I saw that in historical mosques and contemporary mosques, where a space is built all access, and then someone shows up one day and says, well, let's put up this little temporary wall here so we know where everyone's space is. And
Right.
then that wall becomes this, and then that, and then it just becomes a whole separate place.
Right. Right.
As a woman, feels very alienating.
Right. Well, because the reason I'm kind of probing this is that my students ask me the same questions. When I give them this assignment to design a mosque, I give them a program, and the program for the unarchitectural initiated is that thing that tells you what you have to provide as an architect. Sometimes architects are handed the program. Sometimes they work with the client to actually create the program itself. And then some architects just get the program and don't ask any questions, right? It's like, okay, this is what you want. This is what we'll give you, exactly what you want. And there's a kind of this sort of contention in architectural education is, how far do you go with just taking what you get, as an architect, right? So when I give them the program for my course for this design assignment, I actually say, okay, on the first floor, there's an entrance for men, and there's a place for men to pray, and a place for ablutions for men. And on the second floor, there is a place for women. There is a space for them to pray. There's a place for ablutions for women. But I also tell my students that they might question what I'm giving them. And of course, students are not used to questioning professors. We're all supposed to be too intimidating for that to happen. So I kind of invite them to push back, in this case. And some of them do. That's part of the education process, I think, in the studio, which is that architects need to push back sometimes about what's happening. And I think that the reason that we have mosques that have these gender separations is that people have not pushed back, or we have been given space there is a space. And I think that there was a key phrase that you used here a few minutes ago, which is that the separations that you have seen in these mosques are ad hoc. The word ad hoc. These were done long after there was any architect involved with designing these buildings, right? And I remember there's this really incredible image from your research of women sitting behind bookcases that I think had little holes drilled in them, if I remember the image correctly. And it's the idea that you would be sitting behind these bookcases, peering through these little holes at what was going on. And I've got to ask you, is this probably the worst example you've ever seen?
No. Oh no. Oh no.
Okay. Tell us a little bit about that. What are some of the horrendous examples?
It's good. I mean, it's a good point. And I think that there is certainly a lot of curiosity and interest about the woman. And I think the woman in Islam has been fetishized or orientalized in popular culture in general. So there is this kind of desire to kind of talk about, how is she enclosed? How is she circumscribed? How horrible it is. And for me, I acknowledge the reality of the range of spaces, but the narrative in my book is about the range of spaces, right?
Okay.
And about documenting that, and this was hard to do, as impartially as I could, and allowing the facts, the images, and the drawings to speak for themselves, right?
Yes.
and
Yes.
showing the range, but also celebrating when it was designed well, when it was completely inclusive, how that impacted the use of the mosque generationally beyond the Muslim community, right?
Okay.
And to make an argument for this kind of space, right?
Okay.
And so I did see a range of spaces from, and the worst would be that you would be in a space where you couldn't see the main space, no view. I call it a room with no view.
A
That is,
room with no view. Right.
that is the worst.
Okay. Okay. So you were, it's interesting that you bring this up because that you can't see, because what we're describing here cuts across sacred space in all Abrahamic faiths, right? There are spaces like this in Judaism, and there are spaces like this in Christianity. So could you comment on that? When you did your research, did you look at space in other Abrahamic faiths and draw any kind of conclusions about the way women, the gender separation that was going on in these other kinds of sacred spaces?
Yeah, and not in this project. In my PhD, I did look at cultural influences. So wherever there was a mosque constructed, I was very keen on studying cultural influences and how that came through in the architecture of the mosque. And as I just mentioned with the Ottoman example, the influence of the Byzantine church was so profound on the design of the Ottoman mosque, which spread far and wide in the empire. And I certainly looked at and identified patterns with other faiths, such as the separated spaces in some historical synagogues or historical churches. But for this book, I looked exclusively at the mosque. However, I was able to give a kind of a bit of a nuance to it because a lot of the mosques I studied were in converted spaces, right? And how those conversions translated into the new space. One of many of the mosques, not overwhelmingly, but a certain proportion of converted spaces were in sacred spaces that weren't in Islam. So they were sold previously. I saw everything from former churches and Jehovah's Witness hall, kingdom halls, and a synagogue and a temple that had been converted and became a mosque, and how that kind of layered into the design of the mosque as well.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Now, you a few minutes ago, you mentioned something that I think has come out with your research that you shared with my students a few days ago, which was this whole idea that when you eliminate the gender separation, all sorts of other things happen within the community, the faith community. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, this was really profound for me. I mean, this is something I knew that it would be a better space if it was closer to that prototypical example. But what was very profound was to visit a range of spaces across the country and to visit a number of them where there wasn't a gender separation and to talk to people there. And one example I talked to your class about was when I went to the Niagara Falls Mosque, right? And it has one of the oldest communities in Ontario is in Niagara Falls. And I walked into the mosque, and it's got a mosque and a school area and a range of programs. And I'm like, oh, I have an appointment with President so-and-so. Can I speak to President so-and-so? And a young woman showed up, and I'm like, oh, you're the president. And she's like, yeah. And I'm like, how? And she's like, what are you talking about? Right. And she's like, I was born here. I grew up here. I always had full access. I was a part of every activity in this mosque. I was the treasurer. I was the vice president. Of course, I'm the president. And she's telling me this as she's patting on the head of her children. And, her children would be the third or fourth generation of Muslims in Niagara Falls using the mosque, right? And so the impact of the architecture on how a space is used is so profound. There's a film I think I recommended to your students to look at called Unmosqued, and it documents generations of Muslims, second and third, who feel so disconnected from this mosque that they've become unmosqued, right? They no longer use the space.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
If communities are lamenting the loss of participation, I believe 100% it comes back to accessibility.
Okay. So it's interesting that when this gender separation is eliminated or isn't present in the worship space, which is the most important space, some would say, in the entire facility, that it has these ripple effects throughout the community, and it also has ripple effects throughout the architecture that people feel a different orientation towards the faith community that they're part of. That's, I mean, and you've seen that over and over again.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. 100%.
Yeah.
Yeah. Are there, I wanted to just see if there were any questions
I
in
was
the
just
room
about
as
to say,
well.
I saw something I wanted to address that was brought up. I just read it quickly. I don't have a chance to type it. So there's a hadith that I came across. So one of these 9th century sayings describing how to pray in a mosque. Now, back in the 7th and 8th centuries, men in the Middle East, there wasn't really this invention of undergarments, right? So people wrapped themselves with clothing, right? And if you bent over, you know, something might appear. And so there is a hadith specifically describing two different hadiths describing 2 very important behavioral things. The first one is ghad al-basar, which means lower your gaze. Do not dwell your gaze on someone else. That's the first thing. The second thing is it's prescribing kind of an ordering of prayer that is social, where men could be in the first few rows, younger boys in the middle, and then women behind them, and to lower your gaze while you're praying so that you don't inadvertently see something that you should dwell on, right? You're in a house of worship, as someone noted here, but you're submitting yourself to God, and your active prayer is looking down to the ground. So you are not to dwell your gaze. So these are really interesting for me because these are behavioral suggestions. Never once did it say in Islam, in the Quran, or did the Prophet say, build a wall because you might see a woman. It said, lower your gaze. And, you know, I prayed at Mecca and I did my circumambulation. And when they called the prayer, I stopped and prayed and I bowed down. Beside me, behind me, in front of me were women. Nothing happened. Right. And so this is like about kind of instilling in the community this idea of the ideal behavior while you're praying, right? But the mosque is much more than worship. It is a place of community and activity. So I hope I addressed some of the questions here, but there's some really great comments I'll take a look at shortly.
I'd love to add a point. Thank you for the fascinating dialogue and all the great questions. Based on your last point, considering you had done some comparative work in your dissertation on other religions as well, I'll add that there is in Judaism, which is my own religion, there is something called the fence around the Torah. So there are the 613 commandments in the Torah, but then the fence around the Torah are additional commandments to ensure that one keeps the primary commandments. And so it reminds me architecturally of the wall that we're talking about that would separate the women and the men. So there are behavioral commands, not that I'm propagating the wall, by the way, but it just reminds me of this idea that you put up an extra layer of, be it architecture or clothing or whatnot, to protect oneself so that you can always keep what must be kept. Because of human nature, I would assume, is why we created these things. But I just wanted to kind of give that parallel. I thought it was really interesting that perhaps the walls of separation could be thought about as the extra fence, so to speak.
So
that are,
it's interesting, Vanessa, that you bring this up, that you actually have a term within the Torah for this extra set of rules, right?
in the rabbinic writings anyway. Yeah, the extra set.
So there's this kind of architectural element in the text. I mean, it's kind of referred to as kind of an extra fence, you know, the sort of a, that's fascinating. I find it fascinating, but that you're sort of thinking architecturally within the text itself.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah. I hadn't thought about it that way. That's absolutely true. Thank you. I see actually we're at time. So let me thank you all for coming. Dr. Gaber, Dr. Crosby, let me thank you for a wonderful, wonderful learning experience tonight. Have a blessed evening and I'll see you all soon.
Thank you very much.
Nice meeting you all. Thank you.